Welcome to Around Kansas. I'm Deb Goodrich,
And I'm Michelle Martin.
and it is rabbit season. Of course, it is always rabbit season because there are lots and lots of rabbits.
And the photograph behind me today is actually from the Dust Bowl era, and it is an actual rabbit drive because there were so many rabbits during the Dust Bowl, and they were eating whatever they could get their
Everything,
little teeth on.
everything.
And we needed those foodstuffs for people, for cattle, and for other animals. And hence, large scale rabbit hunting was in full swing in Kansas in the 1930s.
One of my dear friends in Topeka, George Paris, who grew up near Dodge, I can't remember exactly, but he grew up during those rabbit hunts and remembers them. He actually recorded a CD of his stories. I'm going to have to look for that. And I think the title is Back When I Was Alive. And it's all these stories from when he was a little boy, and they talk about riding in to see the movies and the dust storm, and they had to stay in town, and the rabbit hunts. And it's just such a wonderful remembrance. And yeah, and pretty, um, those got kind of, they were kind of wicked affairs. So to make up for that wickedness, I have behind me, nice little bunnies. The stories that I grew up with, Flopsy and Mopsy and Peter Cottontail and all those great stories. And so we're going to try to soften the horror of the rabbit hunts with Flopsy and Mopsy here. The guys, so many of the farmers around, they'll be harvesting and they take their 22s with them. I
Mhm.
hope that's legal. They're on their own land, but the jackrabbits just come out like
Mhm.
flies. They're just everywhere. So that is still an issue. The rabbits eating the crops is still an issue, and that is why rabbit season is all year round.
And I think you'll find in most states
I
across the country, rabbit season is pretty year round. When I was growing up in Michigan, my mother was licensed to do wild animal rehab, and so we many times would get a call and we'd be asked to take baby raccoons, baby squirrels. We had some baby skunks. Um, and these are babies where the mother's been injured or the mother has been killed. And so
Mhm.
somebody finds, the animals. And so people always found nests of baby bunnies. And one time we had about 20, and we had a little habitat inside the house they were living in. And you feed them with an eyedropper, about every 3 hours. And so it was all hands on deck in my house. We all were feeding bunnies. And one time we left to go away, and somehow the bunnies got a little rambunctious. They'd had their eyedropper full of formula. They had their little naps, just like little babies do. And then they got real bouncy, and they somehow got the lid off the habitat they were in, and they were all over the house. Little bunnies bouncing around all over. And our big Irish setter Calvin got so terrified he would get in trouble. Oh no, if my humans come home, they're going to think I let the bunnies out. Who let the bunnies out? And he ran around the house, picking them up in his mouth very gently and putting them back in the habitat. And so when I think of rabbits, I have cute, happy, fuzzy memories. I
Good.
had a I had a rabbit named Wizard when I was growing up. Um, but I had never encountered rabbit drives until I studied the history of the Dust Bowl. And um, wow, what an incredible turn of events. And for me, the irony in during the Dust Bowl and the rabbit drives is that many of the rabbits that they were killing them so they would stop them from eating crops and what crops they had left that they needed for harvesting or needed to feed cattle and other animals. And in getting rid of the rabbits, you would think, oh, great, we're in the depths of the depression. People can eat them. But in some cases, there were diseases carried by the jackrabbits. And so, even cooking them, people were not able to eat the rabbits that they were killing. And that to me was the supreme irony of the
Yeah.
rabbit drives, that they couldn't even be used for foodstuffs.
Yeah, it was a gosh, what a challenging time that was. And of course, many people picked up and left, lost everything, moved to California and looking for a better life and found a lot of challenges there. So, yeah, it was a challenging time. And it's like I said, it's still relevant. It didn't all just happen back
Hmm.
then, it's still relevant. Farmers are still challenged with and heck, people with just their little garden. Um, you know,
Yes,
again, where did Peter Cottontail get in trouble? In Farmer McGregor's garden. So
exactly.
couldn't resist that lettuce. So that is still a challenge, trying to keep the rabbits out. I've got friends who have, chicken wire covering everything to try to keep them out and to keep the deer from eating whatever they've got. I mean, yeah, living with wildlife um, can be a challenge sometimes.
And it's interesting in my research, in particular in Kansas, researching the lives of women as in depth as I have. It's interesting to me when you're going through their diaries or some of their remembrances, and they talk about food. Food comes up a lot,
Yeah,
because let's face it, we all like to eat, and so food is something that comes up. And I find women writing about the different ways, the number of ways they have come up with to cook rabbit.
yeah,
And they talk about, their husbands going hunting. And if, let's say you weren't able to get deer, but you might be able to get rabbit. And in women talking about being fearful because their sons were learning to hunt, and they were getting, their first little rifles, they were learning to hunt. And what are young boys learning to hunt? They're learning smaller game like rabbit. And so it's interesting to read women in Kansas, their narratives, and actually rabbit hunting figures in tremendously. We've got some fantastic images in Kansas. In the 1890s, entire communities, they would go out and they would have large scale rabbit hunts. And of course, the rabbits could be harvested for the meat, but also for their furs. The
hmm
furs were valuable. And so you have pictures of men in downtown, Great Bend, Kansas, for example, or Garden City or other places. And they're lined up and they're in their hunting attire. They have their guns, and then they lay out their catch, what they've brought in. And it's like, the men and women who hunt deer and post their big buck photos. And um so we see that going on in the 19th century even.
Well, the bag limit is 10 per day. So that's all you can get right now. But now that's 10 each. If you got to have a hunting license, I think, unless you're hunting on your own ground, but you got to get a hunting license. But you can get up to 10 a day, which shows you how plentiful they are, that you probably won't have a problem getting 10 a day. So, yeah. And for the fur and the meat, my brother would hunt rabbit when we were growing up, and squirrels. And my mother was an exceptional cook. So it was very, very good. And of course, furs were a cash crop too,
Hmm.
still are. And so that meant making money for the family too. That was one of the things that you could do. Remember, Michelle, that's where Annie Oakley honed her
Yes.
skills, was hunting small game, because
Yes.
that's about all there was, to feed her family. And
Hmm.
started supplying it to the local restaurants, and she was just a kid basically, and
Yeah.
that's where she honed her shooting skills.
Well, my husband is from Oklahoma, and he talks about going hunting with his dad when he was growing up. And at times they would go raccoon hunting, but they would hunt
Mhm,
squirrel, they would hunt rabbit. It was primarily small animal.
mhm.
And in the case of my husband's family, in some cases it was hunting for the furs, that were used because my husband is Muskogee, Seminole, Shawnee, and Sac and Fox. And so in some cases, those animal skins were used in different American Indian ceremonies and whatnot. But also in some cases, they were hunting squirrel and rabbit and other things actually as a food source because he grew up. They grew up with very little money, and so for people even into we're talking folks, we're talking the 1950s.
Hmm.
Hunting still is a way for many people to add that source of protein to their diet. And so, yeah, it's still with us today.
Let's take a break real quick. We'll be right back. Welcome to the Western Kansas Wildlife Travel Center, right here in my hometown of Oakley, Kansas. We're the front door of Western Kansas, located on 3 main highways, I-70, US 83, and US 40. And all those roads lead to history, beautiful scenery, and adventure, no matter which direction you go. We now have an IHOP. That brand that you've trusted up and down the road in all your travels is staffed with local folks, real people just like you and me, and we're waiting on you to join us. So for fun, adventure, fuel up, fuel your body, and let's have some fun.
Okay, looks like it's time for our tour. Welcome to the Fort Wallace Museum. Here at the museum, you're going to find some really interesting stuff like our replica stagecoach from the Butterfield Overland Dispatch. We've got facades from the fort buildings. We've got an 1870s flag. There's a plesiosaur that was discovered locally. We've got the Ray pump organ collection. We're a little bitty place with a great big story, and we'd love to have you.
Recording. Welcome back to Wildlife Wednesday on Around Kansas. I'm Michelle Martin.
And I'm Deb Goodrich.
And we have been talking about the rabbit, that cute, fluffy little hippity hoppity creature that we love to see and pet in the petting barn at the zoo, but we definitely do not want to see them nibbling at our garden and our crops.
That's exactly right. Sometimes Jake and I'll come back to the ranch at night, and we've got cats. We've got I don't know how many outdoor cats, and of course there are coyotes all around. It never fails that 3 or 4 rabbits will run across the road as we're coming back, and then it's not out of the ordinary to see a big jackrabbit. So we've got the cottontails and the jackrabbits, and I'm like, how do they survive with the cats and the coyotes and the owls? How do they survive? So the obvious answer everybody knows is that bunnies procreate just constantly. So there's always a new litter. There must be millions of them. There really must be millions because we never seem to run out.
Well, Deb, here where I live in Arizona, the last thing I would expect to see would be little bunnies or hares, possibly, on my hike. My husband and I, almost every day, we do a mile round trip hike up what is known as Spook Hill. And it's kind of near the foot of the Superstition Mountains. And it's about a 13% grade of incline all the way up. And so it hurts going up and it's lovely coming down. And the other day we got to the top and I was exploring another little trail that takes you to another spot to look out and see the urban sprawl that I really, really dislike. And as I was coming back, my husband said, "Shh, there's bunnies." And I looked in this little scrub brush and there were 3 little bunnies. They're probably hares. They had much longer ears, but they were young. And someone who had been up the hike had thrown out baby carrots, and so they were very happily nibbling on baby carrots. And I was just mesmerized. It was, oh, bunnies. And when we did our hike today, the first thing I said on the way up was, I wonder if the bunnies will be there today because I'm all about seeing the cute little wildlife. So, but folks during, during World War One and during the 20s and the 30s, it was all, really the rabbits had become more of an invasive species
Yeah, for
in
sure.
many areas. I don't know about you, Deb, but when I hear the stories of the rabbit drives from the Dust Bowl era, it's it's heartbreaking. It's heartbreaking and it's also gruesome and it's also very there's almost a morbid curiosity I have about it. Because sometimes like this group of people in the image behind me, they are not actually hunting the rabbits with rifles or pistols. What they would do in many cases is get lines of men would literally fan out and they would walk and literally the entire ground would look like it was moving because it was so filled with the jackrabbits.
Yeah.
And so they would move them and kind of funnel them into an area. And then the men would go ahead and folks, we do not condone doing this by any stretch of the imagination, but they were so desperate to save what crops were growing during the Dust Bowl, they would use small little clubs and club the animals.
Yeah.
Um, and one woman described it as sounding like babies crying when they would kill them. And she said she remembered that happening, and then the very next weekend was Black Sunday.
Hmm.
And she said, my mother wondered, was this punishment for killing the rabbits in the way we'd had? And it was just nothing short of heartbreaking.
One of the things that I remember being told was that, of course, they had gotten rid of a lot of the coyotes
Hmm.
because coyotes can get small livestock, chickens and,
Yes.
and small animals. So they could be a serious nuisance. But if you didn't have the coyotes killing the rabbits, then the rabbit population got out of whack.
Right.
So living with nature, that's just always a balancing act. How far can we go with this before we get those unintended consequences? And so that I think, if I remember correctly, that was one of the causes. And then the Dust Bowl, everything was hungry. There was just not
Hmm.
enough to go around. That's simple as it can be made. And so everything was hungry. People, animals, everything. So yeah, that
Yeah.
was really, really dark time. And some of the people that survived those times and managed to hang on to the family farms, we do have some of those century farms here that have been inhabited, by the same folks for generations now. But um, that it was a tough thing to do. It was a really tough thing to do.
Yeah, and you're right. That everyone and everything was hungry during the Dust Bowl, and it's amazing because some of the interviews you read or you listen to, especially in Kansas and Western Kansas, where you've got folks who are trying to manage not only having farm ground that they're planting, but also raising cattle. And you're
Hmm.
right. It was seen as important to thin out the coyote or even the wolf, even wolves, the coyote
Right.
and wolf, the larger predator population. And then, of course, you open up that gateway for smaller species like the rabbits and other rats and other kinds of critters to proliferate. And you didn't have any choice. And to me, what was so incredibly sad was, reading one gentleman's account, he said, it was equally sad to him because in some cases, if he said, we knew if we didn't kill the rabbits, there would be nothing for us to eat in our garden or nothing for us to feed the cattle. And if we didn't have the cattle, we wouldn't have milk. And we wouldn't have meat. And then we would have to go ahead and also kill the cattle.
Yeah.
And so it was this vicious cycle that was so difficult in that time period. And so for them, the easiest thing was to go ahead and try to thin out the rabbit population, which let's face it, we still have issues needing to probably thin out that population now. Um, Even though I do confess, I do just really like to see those little fluffy tails bouncing through the prairie. I like to leave them alone, but I understand how they can become prolific and they can cause their own kind of damage.
Yes, they sure can. Um, yeah. uh, Peter Cottontail should have learned his cautionary tale. You know, rabbits should have learned from him and figured out how to look elsewhere for their meals. You know, without crossing the fence there, and maybe we could live in harmony. But until they do, it's hunting season.
Exactly.
We've
That's
had a
for
great
sure.
time with you. We've had a great time with you today. So I hope you can join us again for Wildlife Wednesday next week. In the meantime, we'll be back with Fun Time Friday. So you can watch anytime you want to and share with your friends. I'm Deb Goodrich,
And I'm Michelle Martin,
and we will see you somewhere around
around Kansas.
Kansas. Bye bye.
Okay, looks like it's time for our tour. Welcome to the Fort Wallace Museum. Here at the museum, you're going to find some really interesting stuff like our replica stagecoach from the Butterfield Overland Dispatch. We've got facades from the fort buildings. We've got an 1870s flag. There's a plesiosaur that was discovered locally. We've got the Ray pump organ collection. We're a little bitty place with a great big story, and we'd love to have you.
21. A trade route was opened from Missouri in the United States across prairies and mountains to Mexico. In 2021, we will mark 200 years of epic conflicts and grand adventures, larger-than-life personalities, and sweeping landscapes. Join us on an historic journey. The Santa Fe Trail lives on.
Find us on social media or santafetrail.org.